Ireland is unique. Nowhere else in the world has a smaller population today than it did 180 years ago. So what exactly happened? Take a look at this graph. It shows the populations of England, Wales, Scotland and Ireland in 1841. England has 14.8 million people. Ireland is over half its size with 8.1 million people. Today, England has a population of 56 million, while Wales and Scotland have tripled and doubled respectively. And then there's Ireland, whose population, both north and south, stands at just 6.5 million. Not only has it failed to grow, but uniquely, Ireland's population is actually smaller today than it was almost 2 centuries ago. But how? It can be partially explained by this, the potato. As the Industrial Revolution took off, Ireland's population surged. While that happened just about everywhere, in Ireland this boom came to depend on a single crop that was cheap, nutritious and flourished in its damp climate. But by the mid-1840s, a problem began to emerge. Potato blight, a highly contagious pathogen that made this staple inedible, was ruining crops across Europe. This was particularly troubling for Ireland, whose population was more dependent on potatoes than elsewhere. But the blight itself is only part of the story. While the crisis may have been caused by it, the consequences were violently intensified by powerful interests, from English politicians to wealthy Irish landowners. The choices they made would turn a natural disaster into arguably Europe's worst ever famine. The blight first appeared in the US in 1843. By 1845 it had crossed the Atlantic before killing up to 50% of all crops in Ireland. That led to food shortages and some starved. But the government of Robert Peel enacted relief measures that helped to keep the number of deaths relatively low. For example, they imported corn, set up a relief commission and created a public works programme to provide employment. 1846, however, proved rather different. Now there was a total failure of the crop, while Peel, a Tory, was replaced by Lord John Russell, a Whig. He was a member of what would later become the Liberal Party. Russell's blind faith in free markets would quickly become a problem. In August, he declared his government would not interfere with the regular operations of merchants regarding food exports. So while the people of Ireland starved, businessmen were still exporting crops to England rather than distributing them at home. Yet for Russell, the free market was paramount. Even during a famine, it was wrong to interfere. That approach was also favoured by the civil service, in particular this guy, Charles Trevelyan, who was Assistant Secretary to the Treasury and in charge of relief operations. One of the first things he did as Peel left Downing Street was cancel a shipment of grain bound for Ireland. His reasoning was made clear in a letter sent the following month. "These things should be stopped now," he wrote, "or you would run the risk of paralysing all private enterprise." Elsewhere, Trevelyan wrote, "Do not encourage the idea of prohibiting exports. Perfect free trade is the right course." After all, how could trade flourish when you were diverting goods from buyers to the starving? For Trevelyan, the relief programmes of the previous year, which saved many lives, weren't a success but instead a perversion of economic principles. Feeding the hungry, well, that was a failure. Later, Lord Russell also terminated food relief measures and halted the public work programmes that helped employ around 700,000 people in early 1847. This led to economic collapse, and by August, as many as 3 million Irish men and women relied on soup kitchens. The ascent of Russell and other market fundamentalists in the civil service and government was transforming a natural disaster into a historic and increasingly preventable catastrophe. Faced with such predictable horrors, Russell and Trevelyan blamed the Irish. Trevelyan even wrote how the judgment of God sent the calamity to teach the Irish a lesson. The real evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse and turbulent character of the people. For this powerful civil servant, free market economics was the appropriate cure for an inferior race. Westminster's attitudes towards the Irish were based on long-held presumptions of racial supremacy. The writer Charles Kingsley described the Irish as white chimpanzees, something seen repeatedly in media depictions at the time. Meanwhile, Thomas Carlyle compared Ireland to a starved rat, which had come across the path of the English elephant, which had no alternative but to squelch it. In the hugely popular Punch magazine, the Irish regularly appeared as monkeys, apes and monsters. Thus, the Irish famine illustrates not only the relationship between political power and economic exploitation, but how such a dynamic gains legitimacy through appeals to racial superiority. How else could people make sense of this unprecedented suffering without saying that the victims themselves naturally deserve it? It was only now that far older ideas of racial superiority and a desire for extermination became naturalised through appeals to free trade, economic reason and calls for efficiency. When an Irish delegation visited Russell to request food relief, he responded by reading aloud from Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, explaining how efforts to help the starving would only make things worse. Smith was also a favourite with Trevelyan, who even issued copies of the Wealth of Nations to subordinates while Ireland starved. Now, this tells us something pretty important. The response of the British government was the result of ideological choices. And that ideology, free market liberalism, is still taken very seriously today. Accompanying this murderous reverence for the free market was another theme of liberal political economy: overpopulation. This was an obsession of the economist Thomas Malthus, who argued that if an individual cannot get subsistence from his parents on whom he has a just demand, he has no claim of right to the smallest portion of food. This, in a paragraph, was how liberal economists would view famine in Ireland. To create efficient markets and address overpopulation, ethnic cleansing, starvation and mass displacement were justified. And the inferior Irish race, well, they deserved it anyway. In late 1848, as another outbreak of blight was underway, evictions of Irish tenant farmers soared. By August 1849, some 800,000 people were on outdoor relief, and by the end of the year, 250,000 lived in workhouses, while roughly the same number had emigrated. By 1851, Ireland's population had fallen by 1.6 million, around a fifth of what it had been 6 years earlier. In the years that followed, hundreds of thousands more emigrated, and the island's population would continue to drop well into the 1930s. To date, this has happened nowhere else in Europe. In such circumstances, Irish landlords were as much a menace as London politicians. Indeed, 3 of the island's biggest landlords, Palmerston, Clanricarde and Lansdowne, served in Russell's government. By good fortune, the laws of liberal economics and a dash of divine providence meant they could clear out tenants and make yet more money. How convenient. Inevitably, some landlords were targeted for their brutality and for paying tenants to board so-called coffin ships, usually bound for North America. One was Major Dennis Mahon. In the summer of 1847, he paid for 1,490 of his tenants to board coffin ships to Canada. But the conditions on board were so appalling that a third of the passengers died at sea, with several hundred more dying after they landed. When news reached Ireland that autumn, there was huge anger amongst the tenants that remained on Mahon's land. And one night, that November, he was shot and killed. And yet, the British press presented Mahon's death as a barbarous act against a virtuous man. It seemed that his passing was worthy of more attention than the thousands of people who died crossing the Atlantic at his behest. To avoid a repeat of Mahon's execution, Palmerston proposed a collective punishment for the largely devout Catholic communities of the tenants. If a landlord was attacked in a certain area, then the local priest would be removed. Now, this was a severe punishment for these communities in which the priest was hugely important, even more so when large numbers of people were dying and thus needed to be served their last rites. Given that Palmerston himself sent thousands of his own tenants across the Atlantic in coffin ships, it's hardly surprising that he would want to discourage attacks, however. In 1847, some 2,000 of his own tenants arrived in Quebec, and on seeing them, Adam Ferry, chairman of the Emigration Committee in Canada, asked how men pretending to be Christians, and especially British, could be guilty of such barbarity. And Palmerston? Well, he would become Prime Minister a little more than a decade later. Some British figures even openly called for genocide. In August 1848, Lord Clarendon said he preferred to sweep Connaught clean and turn upon it new men and English money just as one would to Australia or any freshly discovered colony. Elsewhere, the economist Nassau Senior reputedly told the master of Balliol College that even if 1 million Irish died, it would do no good, the implication being the island had to be cleansed of the Irish. Article 2 of the UN Convention on Genocide defines it as acts committed with intent to destroy, in whole or part, a national, ethnic, racial or religious group. This can include killing members of the group, causing them serious bodily or mental harm, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, and imposing measures intended to prevent births. Every action on that list happened in Ireland, and by this definition, the British government was responsible for genocide there. What's more, this state-sanctioned murder, hard as it might be for supporters of market economics to hear, was done in the name of their orthodoxy.
Free markets are predicated on an idea of equality in rights and the idea of every human being made, this is why I say there's a Judeo-Christian heritage to free markets, every human being made in the image of God, which I think is the single most important sentence written in the history of humanity.
When we talk about genocide and ideology, we rarely think of people who like to quote Adam Smith or who look like Lord Russell. It's easier to limit such thinking to Mao or Stalin, forgetting that Britain, like them, murdered on an immense scale in the name of an idea. The only difference being we still live in the world that Britain's liberal economists created, where 1 billion people go to bed hungry every night and where efforts to change such a situation, as was claimed about Ireland, is destined not only to fail, but make things worse.
The real beneficiaries of free markets are the invisible man, the consumer, the ordinary worker. Those are the real people who benefit from free markets.
Today, Ireland's population is still 25% lower than it was 2 centuries ago. Now, this is a phenomenon that hasn't been repeated anywhere else on Earth. What's more, it happened right here, next to Britain. The country that gave the world the ideas and practices of modern capitalism enforced and exacerbated a famine right on its own doorstep. But that isn't a coincidence. Indeed, it was the inevitable consequence of those ideas being applied. The potato famine wasn't just caused by potato blight, but a new set of economic values coupled with political power and older ideas of racial superiority. In that respect, 1840s Ireland was a blueprint. Over the following century, the British Empire would repeatedly deploy the same dynamic, all in the name of the same ideology, market capitalism, coming at a cost of tens of millions of lives.
Mr. Biden, a quick word for the BBC.
The BBC, I'm Irish.